Tengo el gusto de presentar de nuevo en este auditorio, porque es la tercera vez que está entre nosotros, a Richard Ingersoll, que reside habitualmente en Florencia, y ya es la tercera vez que imparte un curso dentro del máster en diseño arquitectónico, como está haciendo ahora, y pues tenemos la satisfacción de contar con él de modo habitual. Algunos le veríais también intervenir, estar en el congreso que tuvo lugar a final de curso pasado en el Baluarte, que es organizado por la Fundación Arquitectura y Sociedad, que también estuvo allí presente. Es un amante de Pamplona también, que le da mucha satisfacción, una ciudad que le agrada mucho. Bien, sus intervenciones siempre son, como el propio título de la conferencia ya hace ver, sugerentes, originales y siempre pues muy atractivas. Una visión muy distinta a la del puro arquitecto, que se limita a construir y que, bueno, tiene una visión incluso a veces pues, un poco más crítica respecto a lo que hacemos los arquitectos, lo cual es muy interesante. Bueno, pues ya le dejo la palabra, Richard. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, José Manuel. I'm sorry, I will speak in English, because if I tried to speak in Spanish, it would be ridiculous. And so please try to follow. Dinosaurs lived on this planet 140 million years ago, and they disappeared. Many other species disappeared, and today the question is whether the human species will continue to survive on the planet. There is some doubt. There's some doubt because of the ecology crisis that we see manifested almost every day. And so one needs to reconsider urbanism because of this. Urbanism is the greatest source of the consumption of resources, and therefore the greatest problem in terms of moving us towards high entropy. And it happens to be what all of architects are involved in. So it is in fact an architectural problem. That's why I mention it to you as a group of architects. What do you have in common with these people? Is that we're living on a planet that has limited resources, and that we all contribute to this problem. The ozone hole is one of many man-made climate problems, and we really didn't know much about the ozone hole until 1985, so it's a very recent question that we're aware of. The ozone hole and global warming, by the way, are not the same thing. They're different things. Global warming is created by a layer of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. The ozone hole is a hole in the ozone that's above the north and south poles, that's contributing to the melting of the polar ice caps. And we see every day news like this. So we're now getting very callous, cynical about the apocalyptic messages of the ecological crisis. But you can't live in the planet without knowing about it. It's here, but we sort of accept it. We're getting used to it. The city up until the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, had a very good equilibrium between resources and production and use of resources. In the frescoes by Lorenzetti in Siena, you can see the picture of a good city run by a good government that ran itself in a good system of justice. So we have a picture of a city that was much more sustainable. All cities were more sustainable until the 19th century. What throws us off is the advanced consumption of carbon fuels, which occurs with the Industrial Revolution, and then a new system of living. This system of living is called consumer society. With consumer society, everybody wants more than they need, and it's a normal thing to want more than you need in consumer society. But in previous societies, people tended not to want more than they needed. They just supplied their own needs. And today the environment of the good city has changed into something that we call sprawl, so that sprawl has been taking over most of the planet. Sprawl is the rapid urbanization of rural areas that leaves it not very urban, but between urban and rural. And you don't have too much sprawl in Pamplona. Pamplona is a very well-planned city, but there is some if you go towards the airport, and if you go out in certain directions, you could see some sprawl. But because it's a small city, it's still fairly well contained. This is the type of environment of sprawl that is highly consumptive of resources, that is making a big contribution to global warming. And this is the sort of thing that you will find all over the planet. So we're looking at roofs that actually reflect the sun and create a problem for heating the planet. The consumption of territory that used to be agriculture for a very quick profit industrial use that will only last for 25 years and then go somewhere else. And I say sprawl then is a word that you may not know in Spanish but I think it's good to use the English word, as so many English words are now used for concepts. It really does a good job. It's a verb, and it means to lie very casually around. In Spanish you would say aglomeración, perhaps. But it's not that commonly used. But there is a Spanish word, agglomération. In French, you would say étalement urbain. Italian is la città diffusa. There are different words for this thing, and there are different ways of talking about it. But it just is something that occurs like this. We have a historic city here that grew up on a tissue, urban tissue, like a grid, something dense. Then it starts to move in the 19th century on the consular highways, out from Pamplona to San Sebastian, this sort of thing. And then eventually, as the cities grow in the 20th century, they start to grow into each other and get confused. So this is what we call fusion. And finally, in the late 20th century, we have a situation of confusion, where the institutions have moved from the center to the edge, and it's very difficult to know where the city begins and where the next city begins. All of a sudden, the identity of the city has been compromised by the process of urban development. This sort of picture is something that you'll find almost all over the world. So it's the problem, in a way, the problem of also higher consumption. A city like Reggio Emilia, where I've worked sometimes in Italy, looks like this from the air. You can still see that there's lots of agricultural things. The autostrada is moving through here. The dense urban environment of the historic center is down here. This is the plan of Reggio Emilia. Now, nobody can understand this plan. I think even the man who made the plan cannot understand the plan, because there are too many colors, and it's very you need to have a hieroglyphic analysis of it, and this is again a problem. Plans are made in such a way by bureaucrats that only bureaucrats can understand plans. And so planning, which is very essential to the ecological problem, often is away from the people, is even away from architects. We can't get a grasp of what the problem is because we don't have good visualizations of the plan. But if this is a good plan, the question to ask is, will the plan be followed? I live in Italy, where nobody follows the plans. You can pay people off to build somewhere else. I don't think this happens so much in Spain, but in lots of other countries it does happen, that people get paid off. And so if this is supposed to be unbuildable property right here, non edificandi, and you find the right person in the bureaucracy, you can pay them and build there. So the plans in Italy are not basically followed. But even if they were followed, they're difficult to understand. A second question, will architects give a good response to a promising project? Again, this is an Italian example of a beautiful site that used to be the fair of Milan, La Fiera, that has become available to a developer. And the developer chose this as the solution, these three high-rises that are rather dubious, structurally dubious, one by Libeskine, one by Zaha Hadid, and one by a Japanese architect, Isozaki. Okay, so they bring in star architects, and my question always, but you know, we have a good program, but will the architects be good? Will they be the right architects for the situation? And finally, another rhetorical question is us, the people, because all of the problem comes back to the consumer. If high entropy, if the ecological crisis is man-made, anthropogenic, it has to do with the way that people are living, the way people consume. Will we, in fact, learn to live in a different way? Can we unlearn consumerism? Because supermarkets have become the easy way to live, and they've become a transformation also in urban terms, and it's very difficult to go back. This seems to be progress. When people make progress, they don't want to change and go back to something before. So, if we are in a pattern of high development, could we in fact go into a pattern of slow development? There's a very interesting proposal in Italy that was made by a movement that's called slow food, that we could change our eating habits. Instead of fast food, we could think of slow food. Slow food then is food that comes from locally produced markets, and it takes and it's a more direct way of consuming. Not everybody wants slow food, but it's a proposal. In London in 1946, they begin a plan for satellite cities. In Holland, the Dutch planning administration understands that all of the cities of Holland are growing into the Rimstad, the Randstad, and it becomes part of their plan already in 1958. So what I'm getting at is that through planning, we come to a new type of city that is a mega city, a city that is made up of many cities. And it can be well planned or it can be less well planned. In Holland it's very well planned. In other places in the world, like Italy, it's less well planned. In China it's less well planned, but they're doing something about it. So Shenzhen, for instance, had 15 years of sprawl with 10 million people attracted to this economic zone before Hong Kong was incorporated into the People's Republic. But today they're going back, trying to figure out how they could make up for the problem that they caused. How could you, in fact, increase green areas in an area of sprawl? So they're going back and trying to correct the sprawl of 15 years of bad development. The north of Italy, made up of Turin, Milan, Genoa, Bologna, and Venice, has been theorized by this man, Eugenio Turi, as a single urban environment of 25 million people that he calls the Megalopoli Padana. Padana means the Po Valley. This is the Po River here. And you have individual cities, but all of these cities belong to something that is a collective urban identity. They belong to a big sprawl between these places. Milan is at the center of that big sprawl, and you can see that it moves out in a spotted version that's almost like the paintings of Jackson Pollock. And when we try to describe sprawl, which usually is negative, it would be much better to bring it back to the world of the visual arts and say, maybe it's beautiful. Sprawl could also be beautiful. We could find, not that everybody thinks Jackson Pollock paintings are beautiful, but they belong to an aesthetic system, something that's recognizable. Again, that's part of our problem. How can we talk about something that people don't want to talk about? Could all of Europe become a single city? Is the sprawl contagion moving from Pamplona to Bayonne, for instance, the beginning of a connection all around the world. When you go to Basel, for instance, which is in Switzerland, you notice that right next door in Germany is the town of Rhein, which is many people from Basel work in this German town, and they go to the airport in Mulhouse, so that the three cities in three different countries have actually fused into a single urban entity. This gives us a new situation, what I call polynational urbanism. Urbanism that leaps across borders, that doesn't respect political boundaries. Will it lead us to the scale of the dinosaur? No one knows why the dinosaurs disappeared. There are theories. Some people say that the planet underwent a bombardment of meteors that killed them off. Other people say the question was hypertrophy, that they grew too many large animals and they no longer had the resources to survive. And that's why we might make the parallel with our cities. Our cities seem to be arriving at a point of hypertrophy, of being too large. Tokyo, Yokohama, with 31 million people, has twice as many residents as all of Holland. Cities become as large as countries, but they're not really city-states. They're just way out of scale. Mexico City, it's actually 25 million people, it says 18 here, again, has a population that is as big as most countries and bigger than some countries. And it's leading then, some students gave me this picture recently, and it's leading to this sense that things are way out of control in terms of growth, that they're leading to an unbearable situation of being too large. Europe is united, but it's also not united. In other words, politically, Europe now is a political entity, but each country still is very much on their own, and you realize that when the electricity or something like that comes up as a question. But it's theorized about what will happen to the circulation of Europe, and it's also theorized about the economy of Europe, where you can see European unity. The blue banana was introduced in the 1990s, which explains where the money is in Europe. All of the major stock exchange and major blue chip investments are in this fascia right here, from London, Rotterdam, Frankfurt, Bern, Turin and Milan. I would include Paris too, but Paris is missing. But we have the blue banana, and down here where we are is the sun belt of Europe, which they call the Latin Arco Latino, where labor is cheaper, presumably. And so you have this phenomenon like in the United States of the sun belt. Industries resettle from the north to the south because labor is cheaper. This map, however, tells a different story of the connections of Europe, and you can see that, yes, you could look at all of Europe as a single entity, as a single organism, with the high-speed train networks are the ones in red, and the yellow ones are becoming higher speed, and then these are slower speed, as we know, very slow speed trains, but they're creating a mosaic that connects everywhere to everywhere, so that eventually you could start to think of Europe as the Euro metro, where we could, just like taking a metro in a city, you could now go from city to city and it would feel like the same experience. So you could belong to just Europe, that Europe might be all one big city. I did put Pamplona in, see, so you've got as part of your connection. Now, living in Pamplona, it's not that easily connected to the rest of Europe, but someday it probably will be. And you'll get a blur like this. All of Europe will become this wonderful, a friend of mine did this painting, I thought it looks like what I'm trying to say. The cities are all growing together, we'll have a single urban culture and no longer nationalities. Therefore, we could have a situation of Bayonne, San Sebastian, and Pamplona becoming a single urban entity, London, Rotterdam, Brussels, Paris, Berlin, Prague, Wrocław, but Kolkata and Dhaka would be very interesting because they are ethnically divided and divided by religions, and this would be the most interesting to tell us that we would finally have world peace. if Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo would fuse together, one of the major political differences of today would be resolved. So I'm saying that sprawl, although we think of it as negative, might have one very positive result. World peace. It could be the first time ever in the history of humanity that there are no wars, because no country exists that can attack another country. We wouldn't have national priorities. It would be wonderful. But there would still be warfare. And the warfare comes between the rich and the poor. We would have class warfare, which we have always had, but the class warfare would become, you see, somebody's already anticipated me, class war now. Class warfare would be the normal state of things. And the first manifestation of it was actually the attack on the World Trade Center. Was that a country attacking the United States? It wasn't an act of war, although Bush misinterpreted it and thought that it was an act of war from another country, and then declared war on terrorism. But there was no country that he could declare war on. So then he went to Iraq, which didn't make any sense at all, and you know the rest of the story. This instead is an act of class warfare, as the Israelis are understanding. So they're doing something actually to keep another class that also belongs to a different ethnicity from entering into the occupied territories by building this wall. It's an exaggerated case, but I'm saying they would like to keep Damascus from growing into Jerusalem, and they're putting up the wall. Or they've put up the wall. Sprawl, though, is more than just about space. It's about a way of life. It's a way of life of high consumption. High consumption and a new turn on things, which is robotization. All of us are becoming robots, although we're not always aware of it, but we're starting to become robotized. And because of this, we become less dependent on space. So your life as a consumer, because we have a freezer, because we have computers, because we have cell phones, because we have all these new instruments, we no longer need as much space as we used to need to reproduce daily life. So our lives are being despatialized. It's a very strange concept. Difficult word, despatial, but it seems to be the tendency that we are all undergoing, whether we like it or not. And consumerism has everything to do with it, because you need new things, new tools, new materials, and all of this is leading to what you consume. Meanwhile, we look out there and think sprawl is ugly. These environments that are not cities, that are not rural, they no longer look like the countryside, you would say is ugly, and then you have to say, but more than 50% of the urban population live in sprawl. So the next question to ask is, but are we beautiful? Because the majority of us actually live outside of center cities, the majority of urban populations. So it's a good question to think. If we don't find ourselves beautiful, it's a big problem, because it means that you don't like yourself if you don't find yourself beautiful. And so it's very important that people find themselves beautiful. Now, I live in this town called Montevarchi. It's south of Florence, 40 kilometers, and I watched something horrible happen. I lived half the year in Houston, Texas, where there's the biggest sprawl you can imagine, and shopping malls were the normal thing. And here in 1994, they built the first shopping mall in all of Tuscany, in the town I lived in. So it was following me from Houston to this place, where they built big parking lots, and the citizens of this town think that this was a great advance, that this was a great progress. Meanwhile, all of the shops of the city went out of business. So the normal shops, little small shops that are on the nice streets of the medieval city, no longer survive. They've all died because of this. Another thing I've watched happen, it didn't happen in Montevarchi, it happened in Florence, but it's happened in all big cities of Europe, is the arrival of IKEA, which again is sort of like Jesus arriving in Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Everybody loves IKEA. It's a fantastic benefit for humanity, because you can get nicely designed, cheap furniture, and it will change your life. As a consumer, you will do better. It's very hard to find somebody that does not like IKEA as a concept. Also, they're very clever to make you put your furniture together so you feel like you've accomplished something, that you're participating. And they say that they're green because they use recycled materials, and but of course they ask you to buy cheap furniture that will probably only last for 5 years, therefore you're throwing away materials at a rapid rate. But look at the building and look at all the parking around it, and you realize they've made a very anti-urban solution to marketing their product, and that's what I get angry about. There are no solar panels on the roof, there's not a green roof, they could do all sorts of things. Instead, they're creating a lifestyle, and we'll consume more furniture, and this will create our identity as consumers. In Florence, there are these horrendous colors of IKEA, so that you can't miss where it's located, and the city pays for the street to go there. I was very angry because I don't think my tax money should go to create this benefit for a commercial building. But the Florentines really wanted IKEA, so they're happy, and they will pay for this street, and they'll pay for this rotunda to get us quickly to IKEA. And then we can decide whether we want to sleep in this or not, with whom. But the more interesting thing for architects is that IKEA is now moving into the field that you occupy. You can, for 90,000 euro, buy a house, an IKEA house, a starter house, and they're selling them in the United Kingdom and in the Netherlands. This is going to put a lot of architects out of business, I think. So, which makes me think maybe people, okay, if IKEA works, why not more architects get involved with IKEA? Because I think IKEA really works, and so it's like maybe we should move over into IKEA and put the school in the IKEA building, because this is what they're planning. This is an IKEA neighborhood, and I mean, they're not bad as starter houses. They're comfortable. They're just like IKEA furniture. So you do the house, and 90,000 euro for a single house. I mean, that's much cheaper than what an architect could supply. Another problem with IKEA, just because I feel that like they are on one hand very positive and very likable. On the other hand, this is the part you don't see. This is the Italian depot for IKEA. It's the largest building I've ever seen horizontally, and it's all concrete. So they've taken over what used to be rice fields and covered it with an immense structure that is actually larger in size than the historic center of Piacenza, where it's located. And it's kind of the friendly face of cementification. So since people accept IKEA, they will accept this big monstrous building that's taken over the land. But this is, of course, a very bad land use. And it's virgin land. It's not brownfield sites that they're building on. They're built on agricultural sites. So why can't we ask them to do something different? In other words, I think that people let IKEA get away with too many things, and I think they need to put at least energy-producing things on their roofs to make them more conscientious. It's just a little side. Now, let's think about Pamplona. No, just a while, we're coming to Pamplona. But sustainable urbanism. Sustainable urbanism is a contradiction in terms. Urbanism cannot be sustainable. It's about high consumption. But it could be more sustainable than it is. So we could reduce the bad use of resources. We could live in a different way. We could have alternative energy, as you do in Pamplona. And we could come up with 5 things that my group of students are working on right now, which is reconsider transportation, energy and its alternatives, waste and water, housing, land use, people, density, health, and immigration. These are I think the 5 things we've decided are really important in order to change the way that cities are working. And we can see that in some cities in Europe, Pamplona would be one of them, people have a better attitude towards these issues, where you have more options for your transportation. where your waste has been managed in a better way, where you have better energy resources, where you could reduce the amount of energy that people want to use just by asking them to live in a denser situation. So we'd like to measure and compare these things, and first of all we started with this idea that the footprint, which is the amount of land necessary to support the people living in a place, is exceeding its capacity. And currently the United Nations publishes statistics that we are 1.2, we are consuming 1.2 planet Earths. So we have already exceeded what we call the biocapacity of human beings. And we see that the reserve and deficit of biological resources is running out. So this is, again, something that was prepared by my students. And again, looking at the different places and how they rate in the ecological footprint. We don't have Spain here. Oh yes, we have Spain. So Spain's not doing very well. In fact, it's using a lot of resources. Whereas Austria or Germany, today France, are doing a little bit better in terms of this, but all countries are consuming more than their biocapacity of what they meant. And that's the question. We have gone beyond what we can consume. Whereas in the 1960s, many people were at a steady state. So Spain was fine, almost fine, in the 1960s, and Poland was more than fine. Austria was much better off. And again, how can we start to analyze? By looking at what's in the waste and where it's going, by thinking about the use of land. And so transportation is now demonstrated here to be taking up lots of the land of Europe, creating this incredible mosaic of roads. And then analyzing the various things that are contributing to carbon dioxide being released into the environment. This is telling us how many people live in social housing versus how many people live in private housing. And you can see in Switzerland it's the majority here, whereas in Holland the majority are living in social housing. Social housing, as you said, has become a much less urgent agenda for most European countries, and yet it is one of the great solutions in how to rationalize the use of resources and how to get people to live more densely. When people think about ecological urbanism or sustainable urbanism, they usually go back to this man, Ebenezer Howard, who wrote a very influential book in 1899 called Garden Cities. But his real term for what he was doing was called the social city, because he was a socialist and he believed that you need to have a socialist attitude in order to work out the use of resources. And he came up with a diagram which was not a plan, but the idea was that you would have a dense city center here for the administration, and you'd have satellite cities. And you can see this has been copied. It was used by Le Corbusier, it was used by Bruno Taut, it was used by all sorts of modernists in modernist planning. And today, when people say that they're ecological planners, it is the chief model that people go back to. So it's still with us, the Garden City. Again, in diagrams like this, the central city, the satellite city, you can see the numbers of population, and that this would be a fixed population. Between the urban areas, there would be non edificandi, you cannot build between those areas, and they would be well connected by rail. So that was his message of how to correct London, which was sprawling out of control in 1900. And a German geographer comes up with a similar model of the distribution of cities. Here, Christeller's map. So these are ideas that have been with us for more than 100 years. In other words, how to organize the resources and use of resources in space, so that we won't have an overly dense city, but where we have a city, it will be properly dense. Letchworth was built in 1904 to be the model for the garden city. It was not a success financially, but it remains as a formal model that architects have gone back and looked at. Letchworth also gave us the first super block, which I find a kind of problem because it eliminates the city street. Other things that have happened in sprawl that have been analyzed by Stefano Boeri tell us that the big roads, like the road going from San Sebastian to Pamplona, attract new commercial activities, the shopping malls, the great new sources of production. They create worlds unto themselves, the hybrid machines, where you have sort of all the function of a city inside of a single building that becomes a megastructure. It leads to enclaves where a business park is fenced in and only the people who will be doing business here come into this park, like a university. And then the repeated types that are scattered around the landscape, but without any particular order. It's all the same building. It's all the IKEA building scattered around the landscape. Those who have gone back to Ebenezer Howard, so then they're sort of reacting to these problems, include very conservative architects like Leon Krier, who garners the patronship of Prince Charles and builds an example basically based on the Garden City in Poundbury, where we'll go back to a village scale. This is a strange nostalgic retreat into the past, saying that, well, if the problem is development of the 20th century, then obviously the solution is to go back to previous to the 19th century, to the 18th century. Another attitude we can find in Houston, Texas, was the Woodlands that was planned in 1971. There's a chief landscape ecologist, I forgot his name now, Ian something or other, who plans the land in terms of the hydrology, so it's planned where the water is going, plans it in terms of its forests, so you can see all the green are where there's existing forest land, and none of that can be touched. The housing will go on the colored areas, and if you build a house in the woodlands, you have to save all the trees that are on the site. So that was the 1970s idea of being ecological in the United States. It led to an environment like this, full of trees, no sense of where you are in terms of streets, easy to get lost in the woodlands, and the businesses were covered with mirror glass. The houses all have trees in front of them. This is the environment, all sort of rounded roads, very hard to find your way. But the moral is that everybody who lives here has to drive the car more than they would if they lived somewhere in the downtown where it's dense, to go to school, to do the shopping, to go to the business, to go to the airport, to do all these things that we do. We actually multiply the number of times we use the car. So in terms of cost benefit for ecology, it's actually not very ecological at all. It's a superficial form of ecology where you see lots of trees and you see the water, but you're not reducing the carbon footprint at all. That's a shopping mall. It continues this sort of growth, which is now moving across the planet, at least in the United States. One person reacting to it, Peter Calthorpe, has become very famous as an ecological planner. If you look at his plans, they're based on Ebenezer Howard. So I'm just saying we have a legacy of the Garden City, but we probably need more than the Garden City to resolve the problem. Curitiba has become one of the chief places to look because an architect became the mayor of the city in 1975, Jaime Lerner, and that's his picture right there, and changed the transportation patterns, and it was a very easy and inexpensive thing to do, which is always a good lesson. Instead of putting in a metro system, which is very costly, all he did was put in bus routes, preferred bus routes, which you have in Pamplona. You have preferred bus routes, so they're doing it here. And it made the possibility of using the bus an option that 75% of the people of Curitiba choose. So now very few people use the automobile. It's a lot more efficient to use the buses. They also tried to make the bus stations more glamorous, easier to distribute people on the buses, and around the bus station they created cultural centers. So there are libraries, there are parks, and all of this created a more efficient environment in terms of transportation. Transportation and infrastructure really are the key. It's the place to start. And Curitiba then is a good example. It goes beyond the Garden City then to think about the major causes of carbon fuel use. It also had a very interesting program of recycling that I can't tell you about, but to engage the poor people of Curitiba into a business. They created a recycling program. And Calthorpe in Portland tried to do something similar to Curitiba. So he put in transit stations where you park the car and you take a tram to get into the downtown of Portland. And it's had some interesting effect. The city of Freiburg is probably the most ecological city of Europe, and it also has made a great commitment to transportation and to alternative energy. At the train station you find a tower covered with a photovoltaic glass facade, and you also find a tower for the bicycles where you can rent bicycles and store bicycles. It's just a way of making propaganda for bicycles. It seems that 30% of the people use the bicycle for transportation, which is a large percentage of any population using bicycles. Another 30% use public transportation, and the rest use automobiles. So you can still use an automobile, but it's actually more comfortable to use a bicycle. 50 kilometers of pista ciclabile, bicycle paths, and then in the solar region they sponsored a whole series of uses of photovoltaic panels. They set up a factory, just as in Pamplona you have the Eolica factory of Gamesa. They have 3 or 4 factories for photovoltaic panels. So they produce something that they use, and they've put them all over the ugly buildings, all over the stadium, the school, the parking lots. If we look at other models of sustainable urbanism, again, you recognize here Ebenezer Howard right away. This is Van Gurken doing a sustainable city in Shanghai, and you look at Ebenezer Howard's model and you see that they're almost exactly the same thing. This is the Chinese government now, which is a fascist government, I think, but has the authority to create an ecological new town. But they stopped construction because of the current economic crisis. If you look on Google Maps, you can see how far they got. Meanwhile, Norman Foster, the most expensive architect in the world, has planned this town for Abu Dhabi, which is going to be a carbon zero town. They advertise it as the first CO2 zero town. It will be raised up off the ground, so you travel below the buildings and all the buildings will be above you. It'll be very expensive to produce, and that's another question to ask, what we call embodied resources, that to make this town it may cost more than it actually pays off in terms of ecological benefits. Whereas this model is much more interesting and probably the thing that most architects should study very carefully. This is called BZ. It's in the suburbs of London. It's about 20 kilometers from the center of London, but it's still considered London. And an architect organized a brownfield site, so it had been an ex-industrial site, for a series of 100 apartments that are located in row buildings, but there are also 40 working ateliers, so that you can live and work in this place. That's a very important concept, that you have the opportunity not to travel some other place to work. A lot of people using computers today don't really need to travel such great distances. You could live and work in the same place. In the garages, they have a car sharing program for using electric cars. All of the houses have a special sort of insulation in them, and in fact they need very little extra heating. The heating is augmented by photovoltaic panels. There's a ventilation system. They have green roofs on the top of them, and it's very dense. This is then a picture of a neighborhood that could live in great density and use a minimum of resources compared to the normal neighborhood. And so it's a good project to test whether our neighborhoods are living up to the standards of this. Whether it's really 0 kilometer or not is a little hard to prove. The building materials to make this could only come from 30 kilometers distance. Again, building materials are a big factor in the waste that we produce through architecture. So 30 kilometer distance of where you get the building materials makes a difference. Here's another student of mine that tried to analyze what's happening in Bed Z. And another project in Amsterdam is also of a similar scale that is showing you that you could in fact reduce consumption. All of the water in this project and the previous project gets recycled. Most of the waste is recycled, including the toilet waste, so that's a new thing, to create grey waters that can be reused as water. And bicycles are encouraged. It's not a problem in Holland, really, but they've reduced the amount of automobiles used here. This is called the GWL, Christensen, Case Christensen. Okay, sustainable infrastructure. Le Corbusier has guided us away from the dense city towards the tower and the park. And infrastructures have invaded cities like Kansas City to take over all the land. So we need a lot of land to make the infrastructures. Cairo, the road town, Super Studio is now making a mythological project. Could we have a more sustainable attitude to infrastructure? A friend of mine in Florence has actually done it. It's a project that has been going on for 15 years. You need a lot of time to do this kind of project. As they're putting in the autostrada, which is over here, next to it, he was able to condemn these properties and take them over and create wildlife wetlands that no one will be able to build upon. And this is very attractive land for development. So as they're building the highway, he's been able to take the bulldozers and create lakes and keep this property from development. Yet it's right next to where the infrastructure is. So it's combined with the money it took to make the infrastructure. He proved that they were destroying natural habitats and was able to get money back from them. It's what you call compensation in order to create this wetlands. I think in general we need to ask for more compensation for the damage on the planet, and it's an excellent example that he's recreated a wildlife area in a place that had completely lost that. And you can go there with a guide to visit and see the birds that you can't see anywhere else. It's something that we could do. The negative spaces of our city could be like these paintings. We don't think of them as paintings, and then we could rethink the parking lots. We could have, like in Bordeaux, a planted parking lot, put the park back in the parking lot. At the Alhambra you have the most beautiful example I can find of a beautiful infrastructure that is actually a park. It's almost as good as the Alhambra itself, and this is done by Andreas Vass. In Zurich we have a vertical garden that's been put in here by Burkhardt and Partners. You could make different types of factories that, I mean, the factory building, nobody thinks of them as being sustainable, but they could be much more sustainable if they were handled this way by making greens. You could cover, here they've covered half of the volume of the building with green steps, and inside they've put a garden that has a bamboo garden. Green roofs should become obligatory. They are obligatory in Switzerland, just in terms of having proper use of the water resources that fall on the roofs. Half of the water that goes onto a green roof stays there. And we can see lots of conversions. This is the most ridiculous, is the spiral of Hundertwasser in Stuttgart, but and this is again a fantastic example in the hotel in Sri Lanka by Bawa. This is now let's see, I'm flipping by, there's also technological things that one can do since Buckminster Fuller and other people, and during the 30s there was lots of research at MIT to make the independent energy house already in 1930s, and so there are techniques that we have used. All over Los Angeles they had solar panels from 1900 to 1910 until petrol was discovered in the United States and became a cheaper form. People could go back to that. The building that just won the Platinum LEED award is this, which is a California Museum of Sciences by Renzo Piano, and it has a very ostentatious green roof, a little bit too much in a way, but there it is. Plus it has beautiful photovoltaic mosaics going around the side. Photovoltaics are very ugly, but this is a beautiful way to do photovoltaics. And that's the roof. They had to invent little trays using coconut fibers in order that they wouldn't slide off the roof. Then we have green walls. You've seen this in Madrid, probably the Caixa Forum in Madrid, the green walls. They don't make a great ecological contribution, but what they do is create propaganda. People desire then to be more green. I leave you with the thing that I'm working on specifically. This is where my research today has mostly been, where my effort as a citizen has been. I think that to get to a more sustainable city, we need to attack those 5 different problems that we're working on, and there are probably 100 different aspects of urban culture that have to be dealt with, such as consumerism and parking and things like that. But where I feel I can make a contribution is as a gardener. This is what I do. I make gardens, and I try to get other people to make gardens. So I go to citizens' meetings and make propaganda and show them what they could do. That in fact they could take urban sites and make the urban site productive, and by doing so you make people more aware, and you in fact contribute to the positive view of ecology for the place. If we were really well placed, such as in Pamplona, we would also consider the Parco Agricolo, which you have an agriculture park along the river here, and some cities are starting to build them. But you could also just think of the huerta, the orto, as a place to start. So there's different scales of attacking the question of urban agriculture. I call it agricivismo in Italian, which means that it has a civic component to it. It's not just making agriculture, but it's also a social process. And it helps us arrive at we could get more security, we could recuperate land, and we could also have pleasure in doing such a thing. You see these gardens all over Zurich, which is one of the big centers of urban gardening. They're called Schreber Gardens there. This is Dr. Schreber, who's invented lots of machines to keep young boys from masturbating. That's what he was interested in. But why the Germans picked this name of Schreber is a strange thing. But he thought that the effort of making the garden would use up all your energy so that you no longer had the problem of going out and masturbating. But on the other side, we have Priapus, the god of the gardens, who's always shown with a magnificent erection. So gardening could also be something about fertility, about constant fertility. In the gardens of Switzerland, you find these gnomes who are famous as actually being Priapus. This is, in fact, because the dwarf has proportionally a much larger genital than most people. So they're there still. And then these are happy people in the gardens. She's told me that was the last year she was going to do her garden. These are informal gardens. They're not like a great public garden. In fact, they're not open to the public, but they could be. We could organize them as public gardens. In Switzerland, they have a national identity. These are the Italians here. There's Turks over here. And it becomes a very interesting multicultural situation. Each section of the citizens' gardens was actually ethnically divided. But I asked them, do you dislike the people next door? And all gardeners like each each other for some reason. So they share things, they talk about the type of vegetables they're growing, they talk about techniques. They make up rules, so they can't use certain fertilizers if they're chemical. They have to make up rules about what to do with the waste. They have to compost the waste. In other situations, you find the children. These are school gardens. Every school should have something like this. Children up until the age of 13 really like to do this. After that, they're more interested in other things. Then we have another character called Mige, who in the 1920s and 30s was associated with Bruno Taut and other modernists, and proposed that every public housing unit have its own garden. So when you look at many of the projects in Frankfurt and in Berlin, they were actually supplied with a garden that was designed by Mige, and his idea was for the growing house. The house starts here, little box with a garden for tomatoes and vegetables, and it grows, and you add rooms onto it, and you add more things into your garden as your family expands, and you have more people to help you work on the garden, so that at the end you have a very fertile garden with an orchard for fruit and vegetables on this side and a growing house. It was all of these little gardens inside of the famous Horseshoe Project were designed by Mige as huerta, as orchards. And you can see in his drawings here how he's planned to give every citizen an orchard. If you go to Paris, you could find this guy very happy. He's number 139 doing his orchard around that thing. The project I really want you to take with you, though, this is if you want to convince somebody that you could make a beautiful public park with these individual citizen gardens, you have to go to Copenhagen. And on the northern suburbs there, you'll find a place called Nijrum. And in Nijrum, a great landscape architect, Theodor Sorensen, built a series of oval rings or ellipses. Inside the ellipse, you can do tomatoes or potatoes or flowers or whatever you want. Everybody has a little house. They each painted a different color, but there's a sense of uniformity to the garden that makes a great formal landscape. And the result is this. The public park is here, the private landscape is inside. You now have 50 free gardeners. That's another thing. We could have much better public parks. Public parks cost a lot of money to maintain. You could have free gardeners in public parks by having them do these sort of orchards. We could have gardens like this. This is not a public park, but it's made out of vegetables. If you go to Villandry in the Loire Valley, all of these colors are made from different vegetables, different types of cabbage. All it takes is a little organization, and you realize, okay, there's celery here, this is red bietole there, these are beans of some sort, there's onions right there, but each of them is making a different color. They're planted in great density. The food to this is donated to institutions like orphanages and things, so that goes to poor people. An artist, Fritz Haeg, is now doing interventions like this in sites of public housing where they could start to make a very creative garden. So to make a huerta, you don't just have to plant a tomato, you could actually make it into design. It could have a landscape design to it. I'm just going to go on. Could we combine energy with planting? I think so. The infrastructure for holding up vigne in Italy has been combined with the infrastructure of a photovoltaic. And now we have a vigne photovoltaico. Is gardening good for your soul? This man believes so. So he's dancing in front of his garden, and he's produced a special type of garden made with little circles here. It's all, and he says it's all very mystical. So you could have that aspect as well, mystical gardening. He's planted the three sisters of corn, beans, and then okay, there he is. In other situations, gardening is actually a life and death situation, such as in La Habana, where there's no food. And these gardens have been incredibly productive. They're called organoponico, because when Cuba was cut off by the Soviet Union and by my country, they had no easy resources for food, and they've started to plant in between the public housing areas, and they're actually very beautiful. They're based on a French theory of elevated beds. We could take away the asphalt of the world, These are guerrilla gardeners who did this in the 1980s, and they started to take away bits of Berkeley. Finally, the woman who's most involved in slow food in America created a children's school garden. Her name is Alice Waters, and in Berkeley they took over half of the asphalt of the largest school. There are 3,000 students here, and converted it into a garden. You can see the school back here. And this is becomes a resource for education. So the children do the work, but they also come here for lessons. And the food goes into the mensa where they eat. So they've seen what they've made, and then they eat it. They have chickens. This is a classroom outside. So you see, it could become a very interesting resource. That's the mensa, where they cook the food that they've made from the garden. And Michelle Obama tried to popularize this. I don't know if she still goes out to the garden, but they built a vegetable garden inside of the White House because she's worried about Americans who are becoming obese and they're eating bad food. Another resource are human beings who are left behind in poor parts of New York City. Young boys join gangs, but some of them have been given money to come and make gardens, and they've been very successful. They actually sell the food, and they've taken over about 100 lots, empty lots where they can't build buildings, to make what are called East New York farms. All of the black lines are where these lots are. And they've created gardens. They're not beautiful, but they're better than what was there. And it's an interesting way of salvaging human beings, because most of these kids would become members of gangs and go out and fight each other, but now they're doing something resourceful, and they've learned a skill. They've created a farmer's market. They've made some money from it. Another place where you could recuperate people is actually called Restore. This was founded in 1974 in Oxford for mentally handicapped people. So you have some seriously mentally handicapped people who work on the gardens. They come there 1 or 2 times a week. They work with the seedlings. This man was evidently a very dangerous not dangerous, but a severe schizophrenic, and the gardening seems to have great therapeutic value. So gardens can be seen as a form of therapy. These people also are doing therapy with their garden, and they sell the products on the street. People with Alzheimer's have nothing to do. They find that, in fact, for Alzheimer's patients, they notice a great improvement in the patients when they start to garden. So there's all sorts of therapy, and then we can come to great, beautiful gardens that we could produce, taking over brownfield sites, as in Bordeaux. The ex-train yards that were up here were taken over to make the botanical gardens. And I'm not going to go through that, but it's a public park, but it's also a beautiful display of vegetables. A site like this is longing to be taken over. I want 30% of this to be taken over for greenery, maybe made by the citizens, and also by things for renewable energy. If we wanted an agricultural park, I could give an example that has started to happen in Ferrara. They recuperated the walls of the city, and then these gardens started to appear. There are organic farms inside of the city walls, and outside they have left the fields, so we still have a sense of the contado, the undeveloped place. The elderly come to work on these gardens. Those are their allotments. This man was from Naples, and he was never accepted by the people in Ferrara, but once he started gardening, he found that he was a good gardener, and he won lots of sympathy from people. It became a new social space. So gardening is also a wonderful form of socialization, recuperating human beings. The last example is in Milan. This place was the needle park, meaning where the drugs were sold in Milan. It was an abandoned quarry, a real problem for the city. After 25 years, with the help of Italia Nostra, which is a group that is interested in conservation of buildings and lands, they convinced the city to let them replan this area. They put lakes where the quarries were. Lakes are right here in the quarries. Across the street, they recuperated an urban woods, which they call the Bosco in Città. And They maintain this building, which is an old farm building, where they allow the students to come and give them some education about what's happening in the lands. This man who would have lost his job is able to stay on as a woodsman. It's it's a kind of activity that people don't do anymore. And then they planted the area with a type of flower that had gone out completely. It's a wildflower called the fiordalisio. That became a kind of spectacle in itself that people come to photograph just because they haven't seen so many of these. On the edges of the park, they have citizens' gardens. Each of the citizens' gardens has a little clubhouse where they have their meetings. This was built by the architecture school in Milan, so it's architects have participated in this. They've restored some canals going through the area. The fishermen are fighting with the director here. They don't... and then you can also have playgrounds inside of it. A wonderful use of the parking lot is to put a basketball court so that when there are people not parked there, you could still use it for playing. If we then thought of Milan as being an area rich in agricultural territories, these are rice fields that are very close to the center of Milan. They're all in jeopardy of being developed by the high development of the city. Most of them belong to a single person whose name is Ligresti, and he has been brought to trial twice, yet he still can continue to do his bad deals. Our little park is right up here, the Bosco in Città, and this is a bit of land that's been saved now. If we could save these lands, we could start to link them, and in fact we could have an agricultural park around the city. That is the theory that has been put forward for Milan. This is the part that I have my students work on. And perhaps someday we could have an environment like this. I think in Pamplona there's work going towards that, and I'm not addressing this message to Pamplona, but to the world in general. It's going in the other direction, towards a high production of sprawl. But with these sort of gardens, someday we might be able to win back some territory, slow down things, and create a much more happy existence. And maybe we won't end up like the dinosaurs. We can do this. Thank you.